All right, hello, welcome HSS 405. My name is Daniel Estrada, I'm your instructor, and this is the second video of my free will lecture series. Remember that the point of these lectures is to give long history, or to give an overview of the long history of philosophy on philosophical discussions on agency and autonomy, and to situate certain popular debates in their historical context. So we've set up a lot of that history, and we're going through the free will debate really as a microcosm, sort of a historical microcosm of the AI and robotics debates that we're seeing nowadays. So in the first video of these lectures, I went over the free will debate itself, the arguments between the hard determinists and the libertarians and the compatibilists, and how they disagree about free choice. In this video, I'm going to go over the political dimensions of autonomy and freedom, and some of the political theory that arises from this view of what freedom amounts to. So in the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about philosophy of mind and sort of modern theories of philosophy of mind. Let me go to so in this video, I should make myself smaller. So in this slide, I've had this slide in all the lectures, sort of a roadmap of where we're going. We've talked about the ancient view, and we've talked a lot about how freedom and different theories of the mind arise out of the scientific revolutions in the 1600s and 1700s, 17th and 18th century. So we have talked a little bit about systems theory and complexity theory, which is a 20th century idea, but for the most part, my understanding of the free will debate is that it's mostly a product of the historical circumstances and the science of this sort of middle period in this roadmap. So we're still going to stay in this period. We're still going to talk about sort of political autonomy as it's understood in 1600s and 1700s, where we look at Locke and Hobbes and so on. We'll talk a little bit about the implications of that for 20th century, for our world in the 21st century. But we're going to save a lot of the 20th century discussions for the next video and the next unit, where we talk about robots and AI. So just to remind you of the story so far, so we've set up this debate between the metaphysical pictures of Aristotle and Newtonian mechanics, and this conflict, the scientific revolution conflict between Aristotle and Newtonian mechanics, gives rise to these different ideas of what agency is, being alive, being a machine, or being a conscious thinking subject. And to some extent, these are still unresolved debates. These are debates that to some extent we're all familiar with, but maybe we don't fully see the long history, the sort of historical circumstances of this debate. But my idea is that free will is a particular manifestation of this much larger sort of metaphysical debate. And we've looked at the long history of the free will debate also. In the first video, we looked at the sort of ethical origins in the ancient world of the free will debate, thinking about continence and can I control myself to do the right thing? Can I rationally control my passions to do the right thing? But this debate takes on a new life in the after the scientific revolution, where we're talking about whether machines can do all the things that living things or conscious creatures can do, including things like make free choices. So that's the classical free will debate, or the scientific free will debate. Like I said, we're going to talk more about freedom and evolution and freedom in the brain, and really just give a sort of more modern view of how the mind works in the next video. But we're, in this video, going to stick in this 1600s, 1700s context and talk more about the political dimensions of the free will debate and the free will discussion. So the plan for this video is to talk about free will and political autonomy, to talk a little bit more about Locke and Hobbes and sort of natural law tradition on freedom. This is not my area of expertise either, but it's probably important to lay this stuff down. We'll talk a little bit more about the contemporary notions of rights. We'll talk a little bit about human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the UN. We'll talk about positive and negative rights and some sort of rights theory. And this will all come important when we talk about the rights of robots later on in the semester. I also want to talk about certain legal issues around autonomy, in particular those that arise in the context of the castle doctrine, that a man's home is his castle, and different variations of this, such as the stand your ground laws. Again, this is not my expertise, so I'm not going to go into this stuff very deeply. I just sort of want to throw it on the table for discussion from the group, and if this is an area of your interest, for you to have some resources to pursue it a little bit more deeply. I want to close today by talking about the r/place experiment, which is one of my favorite things that the internet has ever done. And I want to give it as an example of autonomous self-organizing governance that looks a little bit like Conway's game of life, but looks very differently from any of these natural law theories. So we'll see how that works. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with Locke. So this is a lot of these slides are from the free will debate or free will lecture in the first video. So just to remind you that Locke is a figure who's working in the 1600s. He has a major influence on political discussions, not only in England where he's writing, but also in the French and American revolutions. Locke is a modern philosopher in the sense that he's more or less committed to a mechanical worldview. He's not thinking about Aristotelian telos in the same way that Aristotle was thinking about it. He's not thinking about rationality in exactly the same way. And in fact, he has this nice little picture, this is one of the reasons it's useful to think about Locke, is because he has this nice little idea of what action is and how freedom works in sort of quasi-mechanical sense. So this is not a full mechanical explanation of thinking, because Locke doesn't tell you exactly what the mechanisms of beliefs, desires, and intentions are, like how they're instantiated in a mechanical world. But he does have this sort of flowchart understanding of what rationality is about, right? So we form beliefs on the basis of our perceptions, and we also have certain desires that we want satisfied, that we're hungry, or that we want a job or whatever. And the idea is that we're rational in the sense that we can take our desires and our beliefs, our knowledge about the world, and use these to figure out what is best to do. And then so we form an intention, and the intention is our will, is what we want to do, and then our will results in some action, and that action changes the world in some way, and maybe that results in another perceptual input to augment my beliefs and sort of keep that rational cycle going. So this is Locke's idea of what an agent is doing. They're trying to maximally satisfy their desires in light of their beliefs by forming intentions for action. This is maybe a more modern way of putting the story, but this is the sort of general framework. So Locke's idea is that actions are free. Actions are free when they correspond to desires, when I'm doing what I want. And Locke's not particularly concerned with where these desires come from. Maybe these are desires that come from our animal nature. Maybe these are desires that we learned from watching TV ads. It doesn't matter how we come to have the desires. What matters is that we're able to act on our desires. And so we're free if our actions follow our desires. And remember, the way that Locke puts this is in terms of the ability to do otherwise. So if my desires change, then my actions will also change in lockstep. And this correspondence between my desires and my actions is what it means to be free. It doesn't mean freedom does not require that my desires are also the result of my actions. And Locke is skeptical that such a thing even makes sense. How would I choose what my desires are when my actions are the results of my desires? So on what basis would I choose to change my desires? Locke says this doesn't make any sense. So Locke thinks that we're capable of free action, but we're not capable of being of a free will. A free will means that our intentions and our desires are also uncaused, and Locke doesn't think that they're uncaused. Locke thinks that there's biological and physical explanations for why we have the desires that we do. And what matters is not whether those desires are caused. What matters is whether our actions follow our desires. So this is Locke's view of agent freedom, of what it means for an agent to be free. This is a compatibilist view on freedom, because freedom here is compatible with a deterministic worldview. So the universe is deterministic. Everything happens in this causal order, but nevertheless, agents can be free. And it's not because they break that causal order. It's not because they somehow transcend that causal order. But it's just because what freedom is that your actions and your desires meet up in the right way. And as long as that happens, even if the whole thing was a deterministic process, you're free. So Locke's a compatibilist. As long as you have the ability to do otherwise, your freedom can be constrained if you don't have the ability to do otherwise, right? So this is the prisoner in a cell is not able to do what they want. Maybe a prisoner in the cell wants to be in the cell, and so it seems like they're doing what they want. But if they wanted anything else, they couldn't do that because they're stuck in the prison cell. So the prisoner is paradigmatically, is characteristically unfree, because they can't act on whatever desires they have. Now, to some extent, I can't act on whatever desires I have also, right? So if I want to, eat steak dinners for the rest of my life, I can't do that because that's too expensive. It outstrips my budget. And so in that sense, maybe I'm not free. Maybe there are these constraints, like financial constraints. If I wanted to skydive every Tuesday for the rest of my life, that's not financially feasible for me. So there are constraints on my freedoms. I can't just do whatever I want. But within my constraints, maybe I do have some choices. And choices here where my desires can shift. So I can't skydive every day, but I can, spend my mornings doing a variety of activities, and I have some choice over which activity I do. So it's not that my will is entirely unconstrained, but I'm still nevertheless free, in the sense that I can act on my desires. Okay, so this is all reminder from the previous lecture. But this view of agent freedom gives Locke a picture of what political freedom looks like. So not just what does it mean for an agent to act freely, but what does it mean for society to be structured in a way that promotes individual freedom. So Locke thinks that society that is structured in such a way that enables people to act on their choices, this is what it means for a society to be free. And conversely, a society that fails to let people act on their choices. And so the way that Locke talks about this, and this is sort of typical in the natural law tradition that he generates, he's partly responsible for popularizing. So I have some desires, and then I act on those desires, and the relationship between my desires and my actions is whether or not I'm free. And so you need some way for Locke of talking about the desires that we have. And so the way that Locke does this, and the way that Hobbes and other political theorists at this time thought about this, was by contrasting our actions in society with our actions in what they call a state of nature. So a state of nature is supposed to be the natural state of humans before we enter society, like before we built cities. You might think about our ancestors 10,000 years ago, or before agricultural civilization really gets going. So it's our hunter-gatherer lifestyle, you might think, as a sort of first pass for now. But the idea is that in a state of nature where we have no social bonds, there's no laws, there's no government to tell us what to do, Locke thinks that we have certain natural desires, and in particular that the things that we do work to secure our life, our liberty, our freedom, and our property. So Locke thinks that in a state of nature, what we choose to do is act in the interests of our life, liberty, and property. And so these are the basic interests that people have prior to society. And what Locke says, and what other thinkers in this tradition say, is that we form a contract to exit to form a society. We form a social contract, a sort of implicit agreement between people that we will pool our collective resources to some extent and align our shared interests in such a way to work for the common good. So this is moving out of a state of nature and into society by forming this social contract. So you don't have to form a contract in nature because you're just sort of fending for yourself. And so Locke thinks that this is a good thing. It's a good thing when the society that we form actually works in our interests, and that we voluntarily consent to that social structure. If the society is actually working in our interests, then it's rational for us to do this. And because we're rational animals, we can choose voluntarily to go into society. This is Locke's idea. So when society is structured in a way that maximizes our freedom in a way that allows us to consent to that process of governance, this is what it means for society to be free. I'm going to go through this one more time, but maybe just back up a little bit and talk about what's going on here. So these are all... Locke's view here is an instance of what is called, by political theorists, natural law theory. Natural law theory is the idea that there are natural laws that operate in parallel to the physical laws, right? So there's this physical law of gravity or whatever, and then there's this natural law of right action. And the idea is that in a state of nature, we operate according to natural law, and in a society, we operate according to civil law according to civil law or social law. But natural law is a law that is not imposed by society, but is sort of the law of nature. And the idea of natural law theory is that even in this sort of natural state, we still have certain kinds of powers and obligations, and we act in certain interests, and that any theory of government has to respect the sort of natural states. So, for instance, natural rights, that every human is endowed by their creator with certain natural rights and dignities. Right? This is the idea of natural rights, that it's not society that's giving you this dignity, but it's something that you have intrinsically and that you would have even in a state of nature. This is the idea. Natural right law, or natural law theory, is supposed to be contrasted with something like the divine right of kings. So a natural law theory is that every human has natural rights, sort of natural actions, that they would be acting in a state of nature. We're not in nature, we're in society, but we still have to respect those natural rights. This is the idea. The alternative, the divine right of kings, is that that rights are grounded in the divine status of the king or the god figure that's the head of the society, and that everything happens according to the whim of the king. And it's the king that has all duty and rights and supreme authority, and everyone has to do what the king says, for instance. And so this is a sort of denial of the natural rights of all humans by endowing all of that, investing all those rights and powers and political powers in a divine king, say. So natural rights is supposed to be an alternative to this. It's supposed to be maybe a more egalitarian version of this, where you recognize that humans are all equal to some extent. But that equality is a sort of natural equality, and it's not necessarily a social equality. But when we move out of, so the idea is that when we move out of nature and form a society, we also form all these additional laws in order to manage society, and these are laws that we wouldn't have in nature because nature doesn't have a society. So rules like no jaywalking, or rules like you have to stop at stop signs and stoplights. Well, in nature there wouldn't be any stop signs or stoplights because there's no government to set all that infrastructure up. So there are no laws about what to do with stop signs in a state of nature. But when you're in society, there are, and the idea is that it's good to follow social rules, and part of the question is, to what extent are you obligated to follow the social rules? To what extent are those social rules just? This is sort of the general problem for this kind of framework of natural rights. Like, when should we accept some social rule, and when should we reject some social rule? Because they're not natural rights, then there has to be some justification for them. There has to be some reason to accept that law. And so natural law theory says some things about what the natural rights are, and then maybe this informs what the civil rights can or should be. An example of a civil right here is something like the right to vote. Right to vote is not a natural right because there would be no voting in a state of nature because there's no society to vote in. But right to vote is something that only comes because we have society, because we have governments, because we're in a social system. But maybe everyone should have that right to vote as a civil right also. It's not a natural right because you don't have it by nature, but maybe it's a civil right because you ought to have it by in order to have a democratic and just social order. So civil rights are these explicitly constructed tools for organizing society. Natural rights are given by nature or given by God. And again, the question is, to what extent are these civil rights just? To what extent are these civil rights legitimate and that we should accept them? Natural law theory is going to say that there's limits to this. So there's some rights that you can't, that are inalienable, that are natural and inalienable. The alternative to natural law theory, the more modern alternative to natural law theory, and I think the more popular view, I think most political theorists have some version of this. I don't think natural law theory is very popular anymore. But again, I'm not a political theorist or a political philosopher. But the alternative here, which is in general much more popular, is positivism. And so positivism is just that all rights and all social privileges and so on are entirely social construct. So positivism thinks that we construct all these laws, including the right to vote, but also the right to life, liberty, and happiness. And maybe these things don't bottom out in some natural law or some natural rights. Maybe positivists are skeptical of the very idea of a state of nature, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes. But in natural law theory, especially in the 1700s, a lot of political theorists took it as granted that what the issue for politics is why do we form society, and what should society look like as contrasted from our natural state. So this is Locke and Hobbes, and we'll talk about that in a second. I should also just mention, and we'll come back to this, that this idea of a state of nature really becomes a popular political thought experiment during the rise of colonialism and the African slave trade, where Europeans were going around the world encountering indigenous populations and then exploiting their labor or enslaving them and doing all sorts of nasty things. And to some extent, this discussion of a state of nature is Europe's attempt to not exactly come to terms with, but at least attempts to process part of what they're doing with colonialism and the slave trade. We'll get there in a second. Before Locke comes Hobbes, though, and Hobbes was around well before Locke and stayed around after him. I think that's true. Wait, 1704? No, I guess Hobbes died before Locke. But Hobbes is around a lot earlier than Locke also. But in 1651, here's Hobbes. Here's his book, The Leviathan. This is a book where Hobbes is trying to figure out the rational principles for civilized society. What does a society look like that is operated on a rational basis? Assuming humans are rational, this sort of Aristotelian idea that humans are rational. Hobbes is not an Aristotelian, though. Hobbes is also one of these sort of modern science-friendly thinkers who thinks that the world is a natural place and is also thinks that reason is this natural process. In fact, Hobbes is maybe the first person to think that reasoning is a kind of computational process. Hobbes says reasoning is but reckoning, and by reckoning, Hobbes means computation, something like adding things together. We'll talk about this more in the next video, but in the Leviathan, Hobbes is trying to argue that, okay, so if we have this sort of computational mind that can think rationally, then what should society look like in order to live our best lives, in order to be the best and most just society that we can have? So the Leviathan is his attempt to think through the idea of what a just society would look like. I should point out that this cover that you see on the screen is the original cover. Oh, let me get my head out of the way. I'm sorry. This cover on the screen is the original cover that Hobbes himself commissioned for the first edition of this book. So Hobbes talked to the artist about what he wanted the front cover to look like, and this is the artist's rendering. And you can see at the top here, here's the Leviathan. Leviathan is like a mythical water beast, or like a giant beast from the Bible, I guess. But here the Leviathan is the state, and you can see on the close-up of the Leviathan, it's composed of a bunch of people. So the state is literally made of the population. And the question for Hobbes is, how do you control this population and get it to govern the people effectively? Get it to control the masses that compose it. So Hobbes is definitely thinking about this complex organization of parts sort of idea. It's a modern way of thinking about the problem of governance. And Hobbes lays out what ends up being the groundwork for a conservative political view. Hobbes' idea is that the state of nature is a brutal and violent and terrible state that we're all very eager to avoid. The state of nature is dangerous, and you can easily get killed or robbed, or so we desperately want out of a state of nature, and so we try to form a society, and we want that. What we want that society to do is to protect us better than nature can. So for Hobbes, a state is legitimate. A state is fulfilling its purpose legitimately if it can protect its societies, if it's effective at protecting its citizens, its people. Any state that can protect its people is a just and legitimate state. And for Hobbes, there's lots of ways you can do this. You can have a democracy potentially that protects people. You can also have an absolute monarch that protects people, and you can have parliamentary procedure. Hobbes is not picky about the way that you form the government. What matters is that it's actually effective. And Hobbes makes arguments that you can have lots of different systems, but the most effective kind of government is going to be a government with a benevolent dictator, with an absolute monarch who has total control of the people and the laws and how things are run, but who runs it in a beneficial way. For Hobbes, one of his big concerns, though, is that whoever's in charge has absolute authority, because if there's any dispute over authority, then maybe the government won't act in time to protect its people. So you need an absolute monarch, an absolute authoritative figure to decide what to do. Now, maybe your absolute authoritative figure is this democratic process, but again, part of the problem with democracy is that people disagree, and democracy takes a long time to reach a consensus. And maybe that time spent building a consensus is time where you are under threat from various attacks. So in order to protect yourself, it's better to be able to act quickly, and to ensure that you can always act quickly, you should have an absolute monarch. This is sort of Hobbes' idea. But the basic groundwork for sort of the liberal counter-argument, which Locke ends up giving, is already here in Hobbes. So Hobbes has this idea of a state of nature, and that we go to society for some particular purpose. And again, for Hobbes, the reason we go into society is because nature is terrible and we want to run away. We want to get out of nature as fast as possible. So Hobbes famously has this very negative view of human beings, and this is a very famous passage from Leviathan. Hobbes says that he's describing the state of nature, and he says, in such a condition, there's no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently, no culture of the earth, no navigation nor use of commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing, such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So Hobbes has a very dim view of human nature. Human nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And when we're in a state of nature, we have no time for arts, no time for any kind of higher, more civilized learning. I'm doing air quotes, you can't see me right now. So in a state of nature, we're in this very poor, nasty, brutish state. We want to get out of that state, so we form a society, and that society is legitimate if it's actually protecting our needs better. Like, you can imagine a society that's just completely exploiting us and we're worse off than we were in nature, and that would not be good. Hobbes wants a society that's effective at protecting its citizens, and that means an absolute monarch. Okay. So Hobbes is the sort of traditional political conservative view, and Locke is the traditional political liberal view. And liberal here doesn't mean left-wing. The way that we're understanding the political axis at this time is not the same as it is today. So it's not that Hobbes is a Republican and Locke is a Democrat or anything like that. Locke and Hobbes, Hobbes is a conservative because Hobbes's main issue is protection from the state of nature. Hobbes's primary concern is an effective government that can protect its people, and anything that is required to achieve that end is a good thing. For Locke, it's not just the effective control of the citizens that matters. What matters for Locke is that we have the same kind of freedom. So Locke also has a view of the state of nature that is dangerous, and that it's there's this constant danger of invasion and so on. So Locke also doesn't have a great view of the state of nature, but one of the things that Locke emphasizes is that people are free in nature, that you can do whatever you want, that there's no constraints on your actions or acting as you desire, right? So your desires can entirely inform your actions. Now, maybe your desires to not be killed means that your actions are always cowering in fear, and that's not great, but you're still acting freely, Locke, to some extent, Locke might think. Right, so why would, so Locke says here, why would anyone give up their lordly status and subject themselves to the control of someone else's power? The answer is obvious. Though in a state of nature he has an unrestricted right to his possessions, he's far from assured that he will be able to get the use of them because they're constantly exposed to invasion or threat. So Locke says it's not unreasonable that he looks for others with whom he can enter into a society for the mutual preservation of their lives, liberty, and estates, which I call by the general name property. So Locke thinks that we're free in nature, and it's because we're free and rational that we see that it would be a rational call to enter society, and that rational call is only rational if we're able to maintain our freedom to some extent. So society is not just meant to protect us from harms, but it's also meant to secure our liberty. And this is why Locke is a liberal, or this is the groundwork for sort of liberal political theory, that not only is protection the important thing, that's what the conservatives want to say, conservative in the sense they want to conserve our protections. Locke is not merely conservative, he's also a liberal in the sense that he wants to also protect our freedoms. It's not enough to have an effective government if everyone is unfree, if everyone's a prisoner of the state. For Locke, the moving into society is only a rational choice if this is the society that we get. It doesn't have to be as free as the state of nature. Obviously, we're going to lose some protections by going into society. Society requires that entering into society requires adopting the laws and conventions of that civil order, and that might not be the things that we want to do. So, for instance, there's laws against nudity in New York and New Jersey, and maybe that's not my preference. Maybe I would prefer to run around free, and if I were in a state of nature, I could just run around free and naked, but because I'm in society, I can't do that, and that's a restriction on my freedom. But Locke thinks that that restriction is still rational if I judge that I end up with a better situation as a result of that sacrifice. So maybe I can't run around naked anymore, but I am no longer under threat from invasion, and I'm no longer under threat from wild wolves or whatever. And that trade-off, Locke thinks, is rational. So I can make a rational decision to sacrifice some of my freedoms for the sake of the protections of the state. So Locke here says, nothing can make a man subject except his actually entering into the commonwealth by positive engagement and explicit promise and compact. So Locke is very clear that there's a there's a voluntary relationship in society, that I consent to the laws of society. Even though those are constraints on my freedom, I still consent to those laws because I rationally understand that I'm better off in society than I would be out in nature. So this is in very broad strokes the origin of the political compass today, where the conservatives think that effective government is the most important thing, even if it sacrifices certain freedoms, and then the liberal thinks that freedoms are also important. Not that protections aren't important, but that protections have to be balanced with liberties, and that we wouldn't enter into a society if we give up too many liberties the society would not be just. It would not be a free society if we were giving up more freedoms than we would voluntarily do. So the society is only free if it's governed through consent, the consent of the governed. If it's a voluntary agreement, social contract that we form voluntarily. It's not just that we form a social contract because we're under threat, right? I mean, this is why Hobbes is maybe not Hobbes' idea of the state is maybe not a consensual relationship in the same way, because I'm under threat of violence, and so when I flee to the state, it's not a free choice to some extent. It's a forced choice. But for Locke, no, it's really important that the state is that becoming part of a state is a free choice. It's a voluntary choice. Because for Locke, it's also something that you can take back. So if the state fails to protect your interests, if the state starts imposing constraints on your freedom that you don't consent to, then that government is illegitimate, and this justifies a revolution. It justifies a change of government. So this is just what I've been saying. Society is an agreement between free and rational people, and when that contract is violated, for instance, when the government starts violating people's rights, people's natural rights, or even people's civil rights, maybe that demonstrates failure of the government to serve its basic interests, and that means government needs to change. So Locke's reasoning here about the central importance of liberty, of life, liberty, and property, and that it's the government's fundamental role to protect these interests, right? This is straight out of Locke. In fact, I might have mentioned this last time, but the founders of the U.S. Constitution originally had life, liberty, and property in the Declaration of Independence. I think it's the Declaration of Independence. Originally had life, liberty, and property, but the framers recognized that they couldn't guarantee everyone property, so they took out property and they put the pursuit of happiness. So now we have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as part of our inalienable rights, encoded in the U.S. Encoded in U.S. law. So Yeah, so life, liberty, and property is what the government is there to secure. Uh, I don't have total freedom. I don't have total liberty in government, but I give up certain liberties in order to protect my life and protect my property. And so, as long as the government's doing that in a way that I voluntarily consent to, then this is a free society. And it's a free society even if sometimes that society puts people in jail. So sometimes people break the law and get put in jail. And when people are put in jail, that's clearly a violation of their freedom. But on Locke's view, that person nevertheless enters into society on the basis of this contract that we're all going to participate and pool our resources and act in the collective interest. And so when the person breaks the law, the person has violated that contract. And so the person goes to jail. Obviously, when they're in jail, they're not making a decision for themselves anymore. You've taken away their freedom, and they would be much better off if they were in a state of nature. But Locke's idea is that it's still just, it's still legitimate, and it's still an instance of justice to put that person in jail, because to some extent they've agreed to the social contract, and so they're violating that contract is what justifies the punishment or the stripping of freedom. And similarly, it's the social contract that justifies things like taxes. So like some people don't like to pay taxes. Taxes are a lot of money. It takes a lot of money from you. You would be more free, you might think, if you didn't have to pay taxes. But you also need all of the research, all the services the government provides, building roads and trains and regulating your food and so on. And if you didn't have that, you'd be at a lot greater risk. So you're paying those taxes is not just taking. It's not just taking from you involuntarily. This is the idea. It's not just stripping you of your freedom by taking your taxes. It is taking away some of your freedoms, but you're getting something in return. And moreover, for Locke, you're getting something much better than you're paying for in return. You're getting all of these protections that you couldn't have otherwise. So it's in your interest to pay taxes. It's in your interest to give up that freedom. And Locke thinks that it's a rational decision that we can make. We can rationally recognize that it's in our interest, and so we can act entirely freely in forming the social contract. Okay, so this is all this is like the theoretical groundwork for the U.S. Constitution and so on. And it sounds really positive, especially if you've been taking U.S. government classes. This might sound like a really positive and sort of inspiring position. But we should be clear that, I mentioned this earlier, but we should be clear that this idea of a state of nature and this idea of sort of natural law is developed within this context of colonialism and slavery. There's, for instance, you see these discussions of like the noble savage, the indigenous person who, because they live in a state of nature, lives in this sort of state of bliss or maybe even blissful ignorance and doesn't have to bear the burden of society. Okay, so all of these kinds of views are, I think, pretty clearly from a modern perspective, they're really racist. They're really Eurocentric. They're not really at all engaged with the political realities of anyone outside of this sort of narrow European context. And when Europeans are enslaving and colonizing indigenous populations all over the world, this sort of justification starts to look a little bit sick. Now we saw some of this with Aristotle, where Aristotle also had some pretty from a contemporary perspective, had some pretty ugly views about women and about slaves and so on. And we dealt with this a little bit about Aristotle, like how much can you blame him for views that he had a long time ago. And I just want to make clear again, I said this earlier, but the point here is not just to blame Locke for having bad views a long time ago in a different sort of social and political context. The point here is really to understand how the views that we have today had their origins in things like Locke and Aristotle. So it's not, was Aristotle wrong for having these views or was Locke wrong for having these views, but it's really to what extent have we adopted the views, adopted these views which we today can see are wrong. So this idea of life, liberty, and property as being the grounding for governance and society being an alternative to a state of nature. This is all baked into the deep sort of theoretical justifications for our political system in the U.S. and in lots of other Western countries. To some extent, these are the basic ideas that inform constitutions all around the world. And they have their origin in precisely this sort of practice of colonialism and slavery. So Locke doesn't say a lot about race in his writings. He doesn't talk about certain races being inferior to others. He doesn't... and moreover, Locke is really worried about freedom and liberty, and he's against slavery in almost every form. The only kind of slavery that he actually endorses in his writings is slavery that's the result of a just war. So if you're in a warfare with some aggressing population or aggressing country, and then you win that war, all of those people were trying to kill you before, so maybe you should kill them all, but maybe it's better to not kill them and just enslave them. And if they're enslaved, they don't have a lot of political power, so they're not a threat anymore, but that's better than killing them off, which you would do if it was just a total war. So if you were in a legitimate war and you win that war and you need to do something with the aggressor population, then that's a legitimate use of slavery on Locke's view. This is the only thing that he really, the only kind of slavery that he really legitimizes. In his writings, the thing is that Locke is a very complicated figure. Like I said, he was influential in the U.S. For the framers who come about 100 years after him. But 100 years before the American Revolution, Locke was actually pretty heavily invested in the colonies and the colonial investments, and in the slave trade that was funding the colonies. And in fact, Locke was so deeply engaged with the political environment in the U.S. that he was also he also contributed to the original colony constitutions in the Carolinas. And in these constitutions, there were provisions explicitly for slavery. Locke was in charge of writing up the passages in the Carolina Constitution that legalized slavery and explained how slavery works. And this was a hereditary slavery, so this was the children of slaves are also slaves, and then you own those slavery children of slavery. You own those people too as property. And Locke lays all this stuff out in the Carolina Constitutions in the 1600s. These constitutions were very informative. It served as a model for some of the other constitutions that were built by the colonies, and it was very influential in the constitution that was eventually drafted for the United States. Locke doesn't defend this kind of slavery in his writings, and so there's a lot of scholarship about, okay, so how much does Locke actually justify this? How much does Locke think this is justified, this sort of practice is justified? To what extent is Locke culpable or morally responsible for his contributions to hereditary slavery in the United States, racialized hereditary slavery, even though he doesn't sort of explicitly justify that theoretically in his writings? Like, is this just an inconsistency? Is there something more sinister going on? There's a lot to say about this background of European political theory and colonialism and slavery and sort of the nexus here. A good essay on Locke's involvement or quasi-involvement here is Welshman. In the reading list, I have a bunch of other essays on colonialism from Locke and other natural law theorists from Kant. I also have some more modern discussions of why colonialism is bad and so on. I don't want to settle those issues. I just want to put them on the table. And I really don't want to do too much of the historical political theory anymore. I want to sort of shift gears right now and talk about the modern discussion of rights, or a more contemporary discussion of rights. Rights frameworks today typically are not grounded in natural law, although there usually is some sort of discussion of inalienable or natural rights. But as a practical matter, it's not the natural law that does a lot of the work. Instead, modern theories of rights talk about rights as being a certain kind of ability, put in the political and legal scholarship. It's put in terms of these four kinds of abilities: so powers, privileges, immunities, and protections. In other words, rights are claims that you can make to do certain kinds of things, to do or not do certain kinds of things, or to allow or prevent certain things from being done to you. So if I have a right to life, that means no one can kill me without a just cause, or whatever. To say that I have a right is just to explain what power or privilege I can exercise. If I have a right to vote, that's a power that I have, or maybe it's a privilege I have. If I have a right against detainment without trial, right? This is an immunity. This is something you can't do to me that would violate my rights. And again, a lot of the question is not where do these rights come from or what is the natural basis of these rights. The question is just what do they allow you to do or not do? What do they prevent people from doing to you? So there's a lot of examples of this. The Bill of Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We're going to talk about the UDHR in a second. But from the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment says that free speech and free practice of religion and freedom of assembly, that these are rights that will not be interfered with. That the government cannot do anything to prevent our exercise of these rights. This is a negative right. We'll talk about positive and negative rights in just a second. But these are the kinds of powers and privileges and immunities that the Bill of Rights is claiming that people have. The Bill of Rights is written in terms of natural rights. It's talking about inalienable rights because we're human beings. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness are the things that we would pursue even if we were in a state of nature. We can talk about natural rights, if any such things exist. We can also talk about civil rights as what particular social protections do you need in an actual society. So not in contrast to the state of nature, but just what are the basic social protections that we need? Protections against discrimination, from unlawful detainment, from searching, and so on. Free speech might also be this kind of civil right. And civil rights and natural rights we should keep distinct from human rights. So human rights are rights that are specifically for human agents. We'll look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as an example of this. In fact, let's just do that now. So if you click up here, this will take you to the actual UDHR. I copied the preamble here so you can see some of the justification that's being used to establish these rights. The UDHR, this is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the UN document signed in the 1940s, 1942, I want to say. And it's agreed to by all the member states of the United Nations. So all 170 nations or whatever have to agree to this general document. It's a living document. It's changed. It has changed several times. And there's procedures for engaging with the document in this way. But all the member states around the world have agreed to this to some extent. That doesn't mean that all the member states of the United Nations actually follow the Declaration of Human Rights, but they make a commitment to it. They sign a pledge to keep the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And part of what that pledge amounts to is that if there is a violation, that the other countries can hold them responsible by, through political pressure to get them to change, through things like tariffs, sanctions, different kinds of ways of controlling the financial and economic and military security of different countries, right? So, again, these human rights do get violated by countries all the time, especially in warfare. The claim of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not a claim that these rights are always protected. Of course, these rights are violated. The claim is that we have a commitment to protecting these rights. I really want to emphasize this about rights, that rights, the natural law theorist thinks that you have rights as an inherent part of who you are, as part of your essence. But I think the modern positivist way of looking at rights is not as something that has to do with your essence or your deep nature as a kind of thing, but instead that rights are about what society is interested in protecting, that we have a common social interest in protecting people's equality and freedom from discrimination and freedom from slavery and so on. And this is a mutual interest that everyone in society has, and that when these rights are violated, we have a collective interest to correct those violations and protect those rights. So this leads into the preamble. So let me just read a couple of sentences from the preamble. So the preamble for a document like this is really just giving the justification, the background, framing for why these rights are important. So this is the beginning of the preamble, and then it lists all these rights individually. But so the UDHR preamble goes, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, and whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common good of the common people, whereas it is essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law, and whereas it is essential to promote the development of friendly relations between nations, and so on and so on and so on. So it's because of these things, because it's necessary to promote the friendly relations between nations, because whenever these rights have been violated, whenever these rights have been met with disregard and contempt, the result is barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. Right? So because of the outrageous nature of violating these rights, we, the member states of the United Nations, pledge to protect and preserve these rights. Right? So it's because this is the kind of society we want to live in, that these are the rights that we're going to protect. It's not because humans are a certain kind of thing. It's not because humans have some deep essence because of the kind of creatures they are, that we're going to protect them in a certain way. But it's really because this is the kind of society that we want to build. We want to build a society where we treat people fairly, where we treat people without discrimination. And if that's the kind of society that we want to build, then we need to protect these rights. So, again, it's not an argument on the basis of the kind of creature you are. It's not because you're human that you have these rights. Although the UDHR preamble is a little bit wishy-washy about this. The very first thing is, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is a foundation for freedom, justice, and peace in the world, it's not actually telling you what that inherent dignity is, or why we know something has it, or whether non-humans can a non-human also have inherent dignity. It's also not telling you what the equal and inalienable rights amounts to, or what the justification is. And what it's saying is that the recognition of these things is the foundation. So it's not that the inherent dignity itself is the foundation, but it's that our recognition of inherent dignty. So in this, I want to make clear that this is not an essentialist claim. Human rights does not require an essentialist claim about what humans really are or what they really need. What it requires is a sort of aspirational or a goal that we have for society. What kind of society do we want to build? What do we want our society to look like? And it's on the basis of what we want our society to look like that we decide what rights should and should not be protected, or what rights should be protected, and what those protections ought to look like. So there's a list of all the human rights. I guess there's 30 of them, and they go from things that are contained in the Bill of Rights in the United States, like free speech and freedom from slavery and so on, fair public hearing, free movement, freedom of assembly, freedom of opinion. There's your free speech. Freedom of belief. So freedom of belief, freedom of opinion, freedom of assembly are all in the First Amendment to the United States. I'm not sure that take part in government is an explicit civil right, or explicitly in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. In the United States, we had to add a couple of amendments to make sure that everyone could actually take part in the U.S. government. An amendment that allowed women to vote, and an amendment that allowed minorities to vote. So this recognizing the 21st human right number 21 here, the UDHR number 21. In the United States, this required additional amendments to our constitutional framework. Okay, but there are also other kinds of rights that we definitely don't have in the United States, like the right to Social Security, a right to work, a right to rest and leisure, a right to adequate living standards, a right to education, there's also a right to health care. Where's the right to health care? It might be, an adequate living standard. I'm sorry, here we go. Right 25 is an adequate living standard. You have a right to a decent life, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. So the UDHR encodes a right to medical care as part of the basic human rights. In the United States, we do not have a basic human right to medical care. A lot of people get medical care, but some people don't. And so this is maybe a violation of these human rights, the fact that this is not a protection that U.S. citizens have. But like I said, a lot of countries fall short of these goals in lots of ways, and the point of signing this treaty is not to pretend like these violations don't happen, but it's to take responsibility and accountability for when they do happen, that it matters to us, and that we're going to do something to change it. So the fact that people don't have guaranteed health care in the United States is a violation of human rights, and it's something that we need to work to change. People don't have a right to education in the United States in the same sort of way. Everyone has access to education, but it's not codified as a right that's protected in this way. These kinds of things. So this is just, again, background discussion of what rights are and why these things are important and how they're justified on this framework of maybe some background of natural law theory, but also sort of positivist law. Of the rights that we mentioned from the UDHR, there's two kinds of rights. I hinted at this before, but there's what are called negative rights and positive rights. So negative rights, so this is not good and bad. Negative rights and positive rights can both be good things. But a negative right is a restriction against what can be done. And a positive right is a requirement that you do something. So, like the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights is that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion, and so on. So, Congress shall make no law. So the idea is that this is a negative right because it's a restriction on what someone else can do. They cannot do a thing. Freedom of speech means that Congress can make no law abridging my speech. Freedom of assembly means Congress can make no law preventing my capacity to assemble with people. Right, so this is a restriction on what Congress can do. They're not allowed to do something. So negative rights like this, they don't require action, they just prevent certain kinds of actions. It's a restriction on certain kinds of actions. Positive rights do require actions. It's not just that you shouldn't do something or you can't do something, but that you must do something. So, for example, in the UDHR, Article 26, we said earlier, right to education. Everyone has a right to education. Everyone has a right to health care. That's Article 25. And these rights are not negative rights. They're not a restriction against doing something. They're positive rights. They're a requirement that society does something. So the social system is required to provide this kind of service, required to provide education. And notice that education isn't free. Education requires paying teachers, requires building schools, and that stuff all costs money. That stuff all has to be funded. And so if we want a society that respects basic rights, and a right to education is one of those rights, then we also must build a society that provides that right by building schools. And maybe that means collecting tax dollars and so on. But this is central to this positive conception of rights. Okay, so this framework of rights and people's inalienable rights, but also these civil rights and what government is allowed to protect or must protect. I just want to give one quick example of this. It's especially related to our discussions around autonomy and agency. And this is the castle doctrine. So you might have heard the phrase, a man's home is his castle. I'm using the gendered version of this for very specific reasons, and we'll talk about it in a second. But a man's home is his castle. This is the castle doctrine. And the idea here is that someone's home should be the place where they're most free. So maybe, I gave the example earlier that I can't run around naked. Well, maybe I can do that in my house. If it's my house, then I don't have to just obey the laws of civil society because it's my private space. And if it's my private space, I can do things that might not be allowed in civil society. So I can run around my house naked, even though I couldn't do that same thing out in public. And that's because there's certain privileges that the person has over their own private residence. And this is the idea of the castle doctrine. In particular, the castle doctrine says that the home is the safest refuge, that it's supposed to be the place where the person has the greatest amount of autonomy and freedom to do as they please. So this is where the laws are least strict and that people have their greatest freedom. And one of the freedoms that this enables has to do with self-defense. So the place the castle doctrine is most brought up is about self-defense, self-defense killing or self-defense attacks, violence in self-defense. So when it's in your home, the rules are a little bit different. This depends on what state you're in. I'm not exactly sure about what the New Jersey laws are. I should have looked that up before doing this, but it depends on what state you're in. But a lot of states have these. So a lot of states have laws where you can protect your property if you see an intruder on your property and you shoot them. That you weren't doing anything wrong because it's your property. And this is supposed to be in contrast to the duty to retreat. So if I'm at a bar and someone insults me and starts like insulting my mom or whatever, like I might really want to fight them and punch them. But in a public scenario like this, I have a kind of duty to retreat. Even if the person is escalating, calling me names or whatever, then I have a duty to back off. I can't throw a punch just because they're yelling at me. I might really want to throw a punch, but it would be a violation. Like they can say whatever they want, but I can't hit them. Also, if someone's threatening me, so imagine that it's not just someone who's yelling at me and making fun of my mom, but imagine someone who pulls out a knife and is like threatening me. If this is a public space, if it's like a bar, then I can't immediately kill that person in self-defense, because presumably I have a way of retreating. If the person just pulls out a knife, I'm not cornered or anything. I'm just at a bar and they're threatening me. This is a situation where in most states I have a duty to retreat, which means I have a duty to de-escalate and back away. And if I can walk away without getting harmed, then I have a duty to walk away and not escalate the situation. And I can only act in self-defense. I can only potentially hurt or kill the person in self-defense if I have no other recourse, if I'm not able to retreat. So if the person has me trapped in a corner and is threatening my life, in that case, if I act to hurt the person or kill the person, then I'm acting in self-defense, and maybe that's a protected action. But if I'm in an open space where I could walk away and I don't walk away, then it's no longer killing in self-defense. But this isn't in the home. This isn't applied to the home, because in the home it's supposed to be your last safest refuge, so you don't have anywhere to retreat to. If you're not safe in your home, you don't have anywhere else to retreat to, and so this is why castle doctrine applies. So you could if someone pulls out a knife at me in my home, there's nowhere else to walk away, and so I could kill them right then and there, and it would be an instance of self-defense. But that same person with the same knife, just as far away from me. But if it was in an open bar where I could walk away, then it's no longer self-defense. Okay. Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not giving you legal advice, and this isn't the same in every state. Different states have different ways of dealing with these laws. In particular, there's some states that don't have that have laws called stand your ground laws, which is a law precisely to nullify the duty to retreat. So in some states, for instance in Florida, the stand your ground law means that if you're threatened, you don't have to run away. You can just stand there and protect yourself in self-defense. So if someone pulls a knife on you or a gun on you and you shoot them, if you're in a stand your ground law state, then that does count as self-defense, even if you could reasonably walk away. These are the laws. These laws have been very controversial. They've been involved in a lot of shooting of unarmed black people. I think Trayvon Martin. I'm sorry, I couldn't remember that name. Trayvon Martin got shot by a guy. He was unarmed, but someone felt threatened and then pulled a gun on him and shot him. And this wasn't protected under stand your ground laws, but Florida is a stand your ground law state where people can shoot people like this and even be protected in the law like this. And this is one of the problems with these stand your ground laws. So to some extent, it does seem reasonable to think that you should have the most freedom in your private home. You should be able to do what you want, and that if someone is attacking you there, then there's nowhere else to retreat to. So maybe you have greater privileges in your home to do things like attack a person or kill a person. The issue, again, is that these laws can be abused, and they're abused in ways that tend to follow the power dynamics in a patriarchal society. So it's no coincidence that the castle doctrine is phrased in terms of a man's home as his castle, because historically it's usually the men who are the property owners. Women usually don't have any financial or legal claim to the house in the same way. And so men can do what they want in their house, including to their wives, including to their families. So the castle doctrine has historically been used quite a lot to protect domestic abuse. If someone's hitting someone in public, that's a violation of the law. But if someone's being abusive in their private residence, at what point is the state allowed to go in and stop that from happening if it's their private home? Presumably the state does have an interest in stopping domestic violence, but the state also has a recognition of this sort of castle doctrine where people are allowed to do things that might not be publicly accessible, and so whether or not the police can actually come in and stop this kind of violence from happening. Again, this is not. These are very complicated political situations. With Breonna Taylor, she was in her home and was asleep and was shot by police who went into the home because they had the wrong address. There was no reason for them to jump into her home in the first place. But when her boyfriend protected herself, and then she got shot, and even though that should be a sort of castle doctrine case, clearly the laws here are not being applied fairly. So Breonna Taylor and Breonna Taylor's boyfriend protecting themselves in a legitimate way under the castle doctrine rules don't apply to them because they're black, and that sort of discrimination and systemic racism. This is part of the problem with not just the castle doctrine and stand your ground laws, but with the way that we're conceiving of these rules in the first place, and really the way that we're conceiving of autonomy in the first place. So I have an article here from Suk on the true woman. The idea is that the castle doctrine and the stand your ground laws are really rooted in what we mean, really rooted in these gender roles, and really rooted in a conception of what the home is and what it's for and what it's supposed to be doing and what role the state has in that home. Stand your ground laws originally start in the Old West, like sort of cowboy West, where it used to be legal to challenge someone to a duel and then go out there and fight them, right? So if you're at a casino or at a bar or something and you're someone insults you, nowadays you have to back off. Like, you can't. An insult isn't justification for killing someone. But in the Old West, it used to be the case that there were these no true man laws. So if someone said something to you that I'm air quoting again, that no true man would back down from, or that no true man could walk away from, then you had a right to defend yourself in that way. So you could, if someone insulted you, you could challenge them to a duel and then go out and walk your 10 paces and turn around and fire. And then that killing was a just and legitimate killing that was within the law because you were protecting yourself. And again, the way that the law was written was about what a true man would do. That it was bound up with this idea of masculinity, that there was somehow a violation of someone's masculinity to allow an insult to go on, for instance. And similarly, about the man's role in his home and as the leader of the home, as the sort of mini king of the home, or the despot, the authoritarian ruler, where the man has final say over what happens in his home, and that might even go so far as things like domestic abuse. So this article is a really interesting look at the legal history of self-defense laws like the Castle Doctrine, like Stand Your Ground laws, and how they're bound up with these notions of gender and notions of the home. And there's a lot of stuff to talk about here, sort of cultural understandings of autonomy and justifications for autonomy. There's quite an active strain in feminist literature that wants to treat the very notion of autonomy as this kind of patriarchal notion that what we mean by autonomy is the sort of man's domain, sort of man's private domain where they can be king of their castle. And if that's what autonomy really amounts to, the sort of your individual domain of total rule, if that's what autonomy amounts to, then maybe autonomy is not such a great thing. Maybe it's not something that we should be advocating for. And maybe it shouldn't be at the center of our ethical theories. This isn't my view. I think autonomy has something more to do with self-organization than it has to do with patriarchy or this kind of authoritarian control. In fact, I think a view where you're looking at autonomy in terms of self-organization requires that any self-organized system is going to be composed of functionally diverse parts that are all contributing in different ways. And so complexity, the complexity of organization requires a kind of sensitivity to differentiation and differentiation of roles and differentiation of identity. And I think that's all very important with autonomy, and I think that's rather incompatible with the kind of patriarchal view of autonomy that seems to come out of the Castle Doctrine. And there's, again, a lot of feminist literature that wants to sort of salvage a notion of autonomy that's sort of distinct from this history. I don't want to decide that for you. I just want to point at that literature and if you're interested in these sorts of discussions around the politics of autonomy. That's where you should look. I guess just a couple of other things, because we're setting up for the discussion of robots and AI, I just want to mention how these issues around autonomy and property and political rights meet up with some of our discussions of machines. And maybe the place to start with this is one of the first laws that were ever put in place to protect machines from abuse and damage or from harm is the Frame-Breaking Act. Frame-Breaking Act is from the 1800s. Let me actually look. 1812. Frame-Breaking Act is 1812. This is the very early Industrial Revolution. And what happened was there were a bunch of political activists who were going around destroying factories. And the reason they were destroying these factories is because these factories used to employ a bunch of people. A lot of people moved to the city in order to work at these factories. And then the factories became automated. These factories got these big machines that did a lot of the human labor for them. And that automation means that people didn't have jobs. And so people thought that they were owed these jobs and that the machines were taking jobs from them. This is back in the 1800s, 1812. People got really mad that machines were taking their jobs, and so they went around destroying factories. This is an activist group called the Luddites. The Luddites did this a couple of times. There were other groups that also did this kind of factory destroying, but they would just run into a factory and destroy all the big machines in order to make jobs for people, because they didn't want the machines to have those jobs. So this might seem familiar to some of our discussions today. In fact, in one of the engineering ethics lectures that I link in the readings, on employment. I talk a little bit more about the Luddites and about this history. But the important thing is that the response to the Luddites breaking these machines is to protect the machines with legal protections, is to say that it's illegal. In fact, it's a capital offense, which means it's punishable by death to attack a machine. Now, this isn't really attacking machine rights. What this is really doing, this isn't really protecting machine rights. What the Frame-Breaking Act is really doing is protecting the owners of the factories, the business owners who own the means of production. So people who are attacking the machines, maybe they're also not attacking the machines directly, but they're also attacking the capitalists who own the factories. So there's a big, long history here of the way that these machines fit into these political arrangements, the way that machines might act as property or might figure into sort of these issues around freedom and autonomy. I think this is really at bottom about labor, about working rights, and I talk more about working rights, about workers' rights and labor rights in the engineering ethics class on employment and automation. This is an old graphic from union organizers. I don't think it's that old, actually. I think it's fairly recent, but this is a graphic of union organizers. And union organizers, so nowadays we take for granted that people work 8 hours a day, 9 to 5 or whatever, 40 hours a week. Maybe some people work more than that. Maybe people work 2 jobs and so on. But the sort of normative standard is 40 hours a week, 8 hours a day. And it's worth recognizing that standard of labor practice today is something that people fought and people died for. Labor union organizers for a long time in the 1800s fought and protested and demonstrated and were killed in order to secure for us today an 8-hour workday and a 40-hour work week. Before labor unionized and fought for these sorts of rights, people would very typically work 10, 12, 14-hour days. They would work in terrible conditions that were unsafe. They wouldn't have time for their own life. And labor argued not for total control of their life, but they argued for 8 hours of leisure in addition to the 8 hours of work. So when you get a 40-hour work week job, make sure to thank your union representatives. So thinking about this history of labor law and rights, and really thinking about the sort of natural law tradition that we've been talking about this whole video, where do machines really fit into that? So Locke does have a sort of quasi-mechanical view of the mind, maybe thinking as this kind of mechanical process. But natural law theory doesn't really give a lot of room for talking about the rights or status or privileges of non-humans, of machines or anything else that's not human. So if there's a machine, then it's going to be an instance of property. Someone's going to own it. Oh, I guess I didn't mention this earlier. I need to go back. One of the things for Locke, what ownership amounts to is a process of mixing your labor with the land. So Locke thinks that you own land when you work the land. So Locke is imagining like colonizers going out into the New World and then finding a patch of undisturbed land, a forest or whatever, and then cutting down the trees and building a fence and building a barn and then starting to work the land and farming the land. Right. So it's that mixing of your blood and sweat and tears into the land itself and working the land and turning it into useful property. Useful property for society. It's that process that makes you own the land. It's what ownership amounts to, is that you've worked the land, you've mixed your labor with the land. And so we acquire this property just as a matter of course, just doing what we do. Even in a state of nature, we end up acquiring property just by doing work. And remember, it's that property that Locke thinks the government is obligated to protect. So if we're talking about machines, then machines are a kind of property, and that means someone owns it, someone built it, someone mixed their labor with that stuff. So they have ownership over it, and because they have ownership, they have absolute authority over what happens to it. In fact, determining what happens to their property is absolutely central for the life and liberty and happiness of that owner. So the owner has a sort of unassailable right over their machines, over their property. So if we're looking at machines as property, then machines don't have rights. Machines are owned by someone. If we're thinking about machines as anything other than human, as being inhuman, well, the sort of natural law, natural rights tradition really only talks about human rights, and it's not exactly clear how to ground a discussion of non-human or inhuman rights in this tradition. Not just human rights require thinking about humans or centered on humans, but also all the civil and legal protections that we talk about, like voting and so on. These are built on an assumption that the basic agent is a human. So if we're talking about machines, all of this rights discussion doesn't really apply. And maybe at the most basic level, when we're talking about natural law, like machines don't exist in a state of nature. Machines only exist as a product of society. It's because we build collectively these machines, especially complicated machines like computers. That requires not just society, but requires an entire global infrastructure of resource mining and resource extraction and manufacturing and so on. Sorry, my cat. I need my cat. Okay. Get down, buddy. Sorry about that. Yeah, so if the whole thing is grounded on what rights are inherent in nature, well, maybe machines aren't natural at all, and so don't have any rights in the first place. Maybe artifacts as such cannot have rights. And so this sort of tradition seems to exclude machines from the discussion entirely. And I think a lot of the way that we discuss AI and politics, or AI and potentially robot rights, I think a lot of our contemporary discussion inherits this sort of framing, and so is in general pretty hostile to discussing robots and rights. But I'm going to give you an argument outside of natural law theory in a couple of weeks that maybe robots do deserve rights. Here's what I want to end with, though. So this is going to be a short video because I don't have a lot to say about politics, but I do want to give... so this is to accomplish a couple of things. One is to set up our discussions of AI and robotics. It's also to set up our discussion of functionalism and how the mind works. But this is really not about how the mind works. This is really a model that I want to talk about as a model for a political theory or political. It's a model of governance, and it's a model of governance based on r/place. So I don't know if any of you use Reddit, but if you use Reddit in 2017, Reddit every year has a kind of April Fool's. It's not an April Fool's prank, but it's some April Fool's project that on April 1st they have something happened. They've done a bunch of different things over the years. And in 2017, their April Fool's project was this. This is r/place. You're seeing it develop over time. So r/place, if you went to r/place and read it on April 1st, for 72 hours, r/place was open. You would go to this. It started off as a blank white page, and you could add 1 pixel of any color to this blank white page every 10 minutes. I think at first it was every 10 minutes, and then after a while it was every hour that you could put 1 pixel at a time. So this image is 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels. So 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels is 1,000,000 total pixels, and there were this was open for 72 hours. So if you were putting 1 pixel every 10 minutes, or 1 pixel, I'm sorry, if you were putting 1 pixel every hour, you could put a maximum of something like 70. Wait, I have stats here. Yeah, so it went for 72 hours. You could do 1 pixel every. I guess I don't have the stats for this. So you could do 1 pixel every. I think it was 10 minutes at the beginning, and I think it was an hour later on. But if you put pixels every single time you could for that entire 72 hours, the most pixels you could put on the screen were 864 pixels, which is an image about this size compared to the full size image. So a 36 by 24 pixel image, which is very, very, very small. So most people did not put the maximum number of pixels. Most people missed a couple of times. Nevertheless, you get this incredibly complicated image. So I'm going to run it again. This is an image that no one individual could have constructed. In fact, anything complicated in this image could not have been constructed by any individual. This required people working together to produce things. And you can see that people are actually producing some really interesting things. Even at this very early stage, you can see Waldo over here. There's a little ski-free monster up there. There's the Rainbow Road, of course, going down the middle. This whole corner is blue, and there's Bender in the blue corner. Looks like they're having fun. You can see a bunch of flags starting to grow. And a bunch of logos. It's a Radiohead logo. There's a Canadian flag. There's the Dota flag, Dota logo. So you can see a lot of logos. You can see the whole thing developing over 72 hours. I'm going to play it once more time. This is my favorite thing the internet has ever done. I think it's maybe the best thing the internet has ever done. It's definitely a contender for the largest collaborative art project ever constructed. Over 1 million unique users contributed to this project. And it's really fantastic. It's an utterly unique image. Nothing else looks like this, or has looked like this, or will look like this. Even if you were to run this experiment again, and there are versions of the r/place website that are active online already. So even if you run this thing again, you wouldn't get the same image. It's almost impossible to get this exact same image, especially in detail of how it develops over time. And you can see as we get later and later into the image, more interesting things happen. Here in the center is the Pink Floyd logo, which is pretty cool. You can see France and Germany combined down here to form the EU. This big black space here, this is called the void. And for a lot of the r/place, for a lot of the 72 hours, the void was this like destructive force that was just going through and trying to eliminate things and trying to destroy things. And you can see very slowly the American flag is being built right dead center in the image, overcoming that void. The void almost took out the Mona Lisa, but didn't quite. You can see other kinds of artworks here. There's a Stussius at the bottom that I see. I really love that they're putting in the start menu, the Windows start menu down there at the bottom. That's being drawn by, probably not by hand, but it's being drawn on the screen. Up there at the top, you see the connection lost, please wait, attempting to reestablish. Again, that was drawn on by users. And you can see the little pixels changing because people are changing it or adding pixels where they shouldn't be. I'm going to let this run a little bit longer just because I love it so much. You can see the void keeps trying to attack the United States, and the United States is barely able to hold on to its flag as a clear representation. This big block of text up here, if you can see it, this is the Darth Plagueis copy pasta. If you know this, if you're an online person, you know the Darth Plagueis meme. They actually wrote the whole thing in text in r/place, which is kind of an incredible achievement. You can see things are pretty well. People have built little bots to help them draw that add pixels at a regular interval and to make sure that those images get up on the screen. But really cool stuff. I love this image. Okay, So over here you see the completed image. This is the final state of r/place. You can see that there's a lot of artworks. There's Starry Night at the bottom. There's a lot of logos, a lot of corporate logos, a lot of national flags, a lot of techno and digital influence. There's Rick. It's nice. Lots of memes. There's also a very colorful image. It sort of looks chaotic, but there's also a kind of order to the madness. Here's just that little Bender in the corner. There's a little animated GIF of Bender throughout the whole thing. So you can see that Bender actually changes quite dramatically. So bite my shiny metal ass, and it goes from bite my shiny metal ass to bite my glorious golden ass to bite my splintery wooden ass, and then back to bite my shiny metal ass. And you can see all the pixels changing because individuals are going through adding other images. So I want to give this as an example of constrained freedom, but more importantly, I want to give this as an example of self-organizing politics. So my central claim here is that this is a really impressive work of art. It's this really sort of delicate social achievement. And that what made this thing possible was not any kind of top-down governing infrastructure, but in fact, this kind of image was only possible because of the sort of bottom-up, organic, self-organizing political negotiation of different communities. And in order to negotiate between these communities, it required what I'm calling a performative social identity. It required performative social identity. It required people to identify themselves in various ways, identify their communities, and more importantly, identify their shared goals. And by identifying your shared goals, you can build these really elaborate and collaborative works of art. What's nice about the identities in r/place is that they're sort of relatively free of the traditional markers of identity, especially things like race and gender. Of course, those race and gender definitely have an influence in how this image develops, but those identities are not, maybe not the most salient of influences on these images. Maybe capitalism or nationalism are more salient influences. But nevertheless, you can see how the performance of identity allows the community to engage itself in such a way as to construct this really big image. So this goes into some things. I have some links in the slides, just on the psychology of social identity, and we'll talk a little bit more about this next time also. But the idea is just that you have a cognitive process of identifying both yourself and others, and by identifying here, it just means like figuring out the properties and the kinds of things, what to expect from that person. And you don't just identify people; you also identify things and objects. And I identify my cat wanting to get on the table. Sorry about that. Okay. So Richard Jenkins, in this intro book to social identity theory. Sorry about that. So Richard Jenkins, in his intro book to social identity theory, gives a very basic introduction to what social identity is. At a basic starting point, identity is the human capacity rooted in language to know who's who and hence what's what. So when we are building our models of who are the other agents in our environment, we use certain forms of identification, identifying who's who and hence what's what. Identity allows me to figure out what you're doing, what your role is, whether I should listen to what you say or whether I should be afraid of you. We do these sort of identification processes, not always accurately, sometimes in ways that perpetuate certain kinds of stereotypes or like racist or other sort of bigoted ideas. So social identity isn't always a positive thing. But my point here is just that we use our capacity for identifying each other, for knowing who's who and what's what, that we use this in order to organize our social behavior, social activity. And in r/place, you have this really great sort of proof of concept that really all that's required in r/place is the capacity for group identification and group coordination. So my idea here is that each one of the little micro images in the overall r/place image, like there's some image that they're trying to build, and there's a bunch of users who are all contributing to that. on Reddit. And each individual user can only contribute so much, so it requires a group, sort of collective cooperation. And moreover, that this cooperation is in conflict, or at least in tension, with all of the other groups who are building all the other images around it. Right. So here in this image, you see the United States right in the center next to the Pink Floyd image. The United States had beat the void at one point, but then the void comes back and takes out the United States. And you can see here the Rainbow Road starts to cover over the United States, but then the United States flag comes back. Right. And so these are different communities, different Reddit communities, different groups of people who have goals that are in tension. One group wants to paint the whole thing black. One group wants to put a rainbow everywhere. One group wants to put the American flag there. And these groups all need to negotiate and coordinate their behavior to resolve it in some way. They need to figure out, does the Rainbow Road go behind or above the flag? Like how do we build this image going forward? And there's no right way to do it. This is a constant negotiation between all the different groups and all their different goals. But my point here is that it's partly the capacity to identify ourselves and our communities that gives us this coordination capacity. So my favorite example of this in the image is the blue corner, and I'll show you the. Let me show you a GIF of it first, and I'll come back here. So this is it'll loop around again. So this is just the bottom corner of the blue. The bottom corner of r/place, and you can see the bottom corner. This is not the full image. This is just the bottom corner. But you can see the bottom corner fills up with blue almost immediately. And moreover, the blue kind of stays there for the rest of the image. Like almost all of the little images around here are tinged blue. So you can see that the blue grows up, it sort of inflates, and then things start to get drawn over it. At the very beginning of the image, they wouldn't let anything get drawn over it, and people were sort of defending the blue, keeping the thing blue. Right, and so anytime anyone draws anything on it, those things get covered over in blue. These little Pokemon started to get drawn. Bender stays there for most of the time, but there's this little bit of fighting. But eventually, the blue is obviously getting taken over, and all these other images are coming in, and the blue no longer has sovereignty over this corner. One other thing I want to point out just in this graphic is right at the beginning. When the blue is, two other things I want to point out. So right at the beginning, as the blue grows, you can see this magenta, these little sort of plumes of magenta show up. And these plumes of magenta, this is an example of a hostile attack. So while r/place was running, one of the more popular streamers on Twitch, Destiny, if you know the streamer Destiny has a bunch of followers. He's kind of an obnoxious asshole, but he's got a bunch of followers on his stream, and he turned all his followers to r/place and said, hey, I see them building a blue corner over there. Let's not let them build the blue corner. Let's turn that corner purple. And you can see they tried. Those blooms of purple required hundreds or even thousands of people, all at the same time coordinating their efforts to put magenta pixels in this corner. And to some extent, they got those pixels in there, but they go away really quickly. As the image develops, the magenta attacks are not a very important feature of the overall structure here. So I want to use this as an example of how r/place shows us how to deal with hostile actors. You might even think of this as a kind of terrorist attack, where they're deliberately trying to destroy whatever cooperation is there. They're deliberately trying to undermine the cooperative efforts that have been put in place. By turning into a color that obviously that community doesn't want. But that community can deal with it pretty quickly. Like, the magenta plume does come, but they can deal with it. They can get rid of it. Actually, let me go back over here. So this is early on in the blue corner. You can see most of it's blue. You can see there are a few stray pixels. But I think the most relevant thing here is the words blue corner. So remember that everything that's on this image has to be written one pixel at a time every 10 minutes. So writing out blue corner here takes a significant amount of effort. And notice that that's effort that goes against the spirit of the blue corner, right? Like, they have to write blue corner in a color that's not blue. And it's weird because Reddit's an international website. This is not just English-speaking users. And it's probable that more people can recognize that this is a blue corner by just looking at it than they can actually read the words blue corner that are written out. So why would people who are invested in this, in turning this corner blue, why would they spend all the time writing blue corner in a way that seems to undermine the very goal that they're after, especially when everyone can already see that it's a blue corner? Like, why would they even spend the time doing this? And it's because by writing blue corner, the group identifies itself and it identifies the project. Look, we're turning this corner blue, and you can get on our side, you can get out of our way. And by having this explicit statement of identity, it makes it clear to everyone else what's going on here, what the project is, how they can contribute. Oh, if this is the blue corner, I know what I can do to help out. I can just put my pixel as a blue pixel. Because I know how I can help out, I also know how to deal with the terrorists, with the deliberately hostile attacks. Right? If someone's trying to put a red pixel here, well, I can immediately see that pixel's out of place, and I know immediately how to correct it. And I don't need anyone to tell me to do that correction, or I don't need anyone to tell me how to police the corner to make sure that everything's going well, because I can just see it for myself, and I can do it for myself. So in r/place, each individual user, to some extent, has very limited autonomy. They have very limited control. They can only put one pixel every 10 minutes or one pixel every hour. That's not a lot of control. But nevertheless, that's enough control to both organize these bigger community collectives that are doing these projects that are much bigger than any one of the individuals can accomplish. But it's also enough control to handle detractors. Right? With my one pixel every 10 minutes, I can correct this bad red pixel and turn it blue and help the whole community out. So by making the goals explicit, you build a sense of community and commonality. You see what the goals are, and everyone knows how they can contribute. And it's that kind of it's that identity that gives the blue corner the kind of stability and resilience and longevity that you see in the image. Notice in this image you can also see these boxes. They're anticipating future growth. They're laying out infrastructure to help the blue corner grow out. Right? So these are people who not only are confident in the blue corner, but are planning for the blue corner's future. And again, this is only possible, I'm arguing, because the group is identifying itself in a way that makes its norms and goals very explicit so that anyone can contribute and participate. One other thing to show you from this last image, so the blue corner grows out. Obviously, it doesn't take over the whole image and then things start taking over it, but people fight out for the blue corner till the bitter end. So you can see in the very bottom corner there's a little solid block of blue, because there's a community of people who are like, damn it, we're not giving up this corner. We're going to fight for this corner till the very end. And to some extent they do. Let me actually go back to the main image. Yeah, so the final image, the blue corner in the corner here is not completely blue, but it's mostly blue, and there's still the blue corner advertisement for it. So the blue corner was mostly successful. It got its way. It kept that blue corner because it had enough people committed to keeping that corner blue, using their pixels for the sake of the community, for the sake of establishing that corner. And this same dynamic, so blue corner isn't special here. This same dynamic happens all across the image. And in fact, if you look at the final image and you go, so what I did here is I circled all of the examples of subreddits that were explicitly named. So this isn't all the names, this isn't all the identities that are being expressed in the image. These are just the explicit subreddits that are being identified in this image. And I counted 20 different ones in just this one little segment of the overall image. So there are 20 different subreddits that are explicitly identified. And again, when you explicitly identify, you give people an identity to work with. You give people a sense of the goals, right? So this is the green lattice. The green lattice thought they were smart because they only have to color every other pixel green. So there was like less work. But the green lattice didn't end up taking up as much space, but it did secure its little corner here as the green lattice. And again, I'm arguing that part of its ability to do that was that it was able to explicitly identify itself and its goals as a community. It was able to direct people who wanted to contribute to resources that allowed them to contribute in the most effective way possible. And that allowed all of these really complicated images to form, despite the possibility of hostile actors, despite the possibility that you're having to negotiate with lots of other people. And these negotiations can go all sorts of different ways. So we saw earlier the United States fighting against the Void. The United States did not want anything on its flag. So anytime the Void tried to pop up or when the Rainbow Road went over, the United States fought it off. But Denmark here's the Denmark flag. But the Denmark, these two little characters are not on the Denmark flag, if you didn't know. But the Denmark community seems to have no problem putting these figures on the Denmark flag. Right, so there's this negotiation between these different groups that they're willing to augment their picture in these various ways. Denmark flag has a detracting yellow pixel here, but overall they have pretty much control of their entire pixels. And that's the case even though they have border disputes with lots of other communities that are all doing their own thing. Right, so
So my idea here is that all of these different communities, with their own interests and goals and plans that are completely independent of each other, and all of the individuals only have these very limited resources on how to act. Nevertheless, you can get cooperation on a very grand scale. You can produce these incredible works of art. And this is all you need. You just need the capacity for self-identification, these sort of self-organizing identification practices that allow all the different communities to settle their border disputes on their own. So let me just go through a couple more images like this because I love it so much. So this is a heat map of the Arsace Place image. So this is the full image, and it's brighter if more people clicked there. So you can see that. Oh, I'm sorry, there's people outside. Yeah, okay, so this is up here you see a heat map. So this is where people are clicking most. And you can even see the outline of the American flag right here at the center. You can see some of those hearts and some of the Rainbow Road. So you can see some of the places that were highly disputed. The really important thing about this image, though, is that most places were not highly disputed places. There are a couple of concentrated points that people were fighting over throughout the whole 72 hours. But then there's also lots of sort of black patches that no one really fought over and that no one really disputed. So part of the lesson here is that when you allow the communities to self-organize this way, there will be border disputes, there will be fights, but not everything's a fight. And in fact, a lot of the territory goes undisputed. The fights end up getting concentrated in particular high activity areas. So here's the time, the overtime version of this. So all the pixels are going, and then the height here is how many clicks on that pixel. So the higher it is, the more people are clicking on that one pixel. And just, again, you can see there are certain areas of the map where there's lots of activity. People are fighting over pixels quite a bit. With the void, for instance, the void was interrupting a lot of other people's, a lot of other groups' images, and so there was a lot of fighting over that territory here in the void and over the United States. Good. Let me come back here. So these are all border disputes, but the border disputes can be negotiated at a local level, right? It's not, do we need a way to resolve all the border disputes, but it's just that, okay, here are my neighbors, and how do I settle things with them? Most of the space is not disputed. Disputes are highly concentrated, and settling a dispute in one area doesn't settle a dispute in a different area. So you can see here again the heat map where the activity is. Almost done. Just two more little images that I like from this. So lots of different communities in a shared space, having to make arrangements, having to concede certain parts of the space in order to build in other parts of the space. Right. So this is an example of a shared space with diverse political interests, where everyone has to figure out some way of getting along. And my idea is that the limited resources here are not really constrained on freedom, because there's actually quite a lot of ways that people can resolve their disputes. They can cooperate, they can fight. So here's two. Sorry. So here are two communities. The Mega Man community that's building this laser, and here's the Dat Boy frog. Dat Boy's just hanging out. I don't remember if people still know Dat Boy, but Dat Boy was a thing back in the 2017. So here's Dat Boy. Here's Mega Man's here's Mega Man shooting a laser. That laser is heading for Dat Boy, and something's gonna happen. And so you can imagine. Stop it! You can imagine a couple of different things that could happen. One thing that could happen is that the laser goes over Dat Boy. Another thing that could happen is the laser goes under Dat Boy, and the Dat Boy sort of stays on top. But what actually happens is different from both of those things. What actually happens is that there's a combination. So you get this sort of, it looks like Dat Boy just got blasted in his torso. So there's blood everywhere. So the combination here is not just one or the other, but it's a mix of both that maybe combines the best features of both, and it makes a new piece of art entirely. Right. So one way of handling these negotiations, these border disputes, is not by deciding in favor of one side or the other, but by mixing them and changing it up in some way. And the best example of this is with the Germany and French flags at the bottom of the image. So this is just looking at the Germany and French flags as they grow. I might want to put this at a slightly higher speed. So Germany starts growing this way towards France, and French image starts growing up a little bit. It gets a little bit bigger, maybe trying to get as big as Germany, but the Germany flag just takes over France. And there's this dispute. So the French try to defend their territory, but it looks like the Germans are growing right on over France. It looks like there's just more activity in Germany defending the German flag. But the French decide that they're going to grow up instead of trying to fight the Germans. And so they grow vertically, maintaining their German flag. I'm sorry, maintaining the French flag. French flag tries to overtake the German flag here. That doesn't work. Rainbow Road comes through. No one's going to stop Rainbow Road. But what happens instead of the French or the German flag is that they, at that intersection, they build the EU flag. EU flag highly influenced Germany and France, two of the big countries in the EU, and so you get this sort of amicable agreement. It's almost like a Pepsi commercial. It's so saccharine in how it's showing the way that we can come together and sort of transcend our differences, even when we're in open conflict. We can still like build a community that recognizes the contributions of all parties. It's like with the EU, right? So I think r/place gives us an actual working model, a demonstration, an existence proof that you can build a self-organizing governance system that is built entirely on letting communities organize however they want, letting communities settle their various border disputes however they want, and giving people the sort of these minimal resources for engaging the space collectively. Even in these minimal conditions. I like this as sort of an add-on to the Conway's Game of Life. Game of Life was this example of a living process in this little square grid operating by these very simple rules. Well, here's r/place as an example of a political process. In fact, not just any kind of political process, but it's like an anarchist, self-organizing political process that develops from very simple rules. You give everyone just one pixel every 10 minutes. You give them this open space, and then you just let them have at it. And people using their own ability to work together, our own capacity for cooperation, are able to come together and build this amazing work of art. So identities allow people to organize, allow people to form collective action. The more explicit the identity, the more explicit the goals, the easier it is to coordinate. And not just coordinate, but also the easier it is to deal with detractors. There will be border disputes, but these border disputes are always local, and they're handled by the communities at stake. So a community on the other side of the map doesn't care how me and my neighbors are resolving our border disputes because they don't have any stake in it. So the negotiation for consensus is always local, and it's always some form of compromise, and maybe that compromise means just shutting someone else out, or maybe that means forming something new together. When I made this video, it was right after the r/place thing, and I was not doing this for class. I was doing this for a culture war sort of thing, and so it was a little bit more combative than I wanted. But you see a lot of people in the culture wars today talking about tribalism as being bad, and I think r/place is an example of how tribalism, in fact, it's not a bad thing. In fact, our capacity for identification and for identifying allies and defectors, it actually helps us organize ourselves. It actually allows us to be more effective at our projects, and it allows us to cooperate with others even when they don't share our goals. It's precisely because we can express our identities with each other, and we can negotiate the boundaries of those identities in ways that are sensitive to the interests of everyone else. This is what allows us to organize as a community. The big advantage of our big primate brains is not rationality in some general sense. Our big advantage is the kind of social cognition that we get from being the specific kinds of social agents that we are. Our capacity for identifying each other, for knowing who people are, or for making reasonable guesses about who people are and what they can do for us based on other properties that we see of them. Again, this is a source of a lot of hardship and human cruelty in racism and sexism and so on. But it's also a source of a lot of our capacity for cooperation. In fact, I think our ability to cooperate at all depends on our ability to make these kinds of identifications. And it's a testament to how important our identities are that they can also be used for such harm. So I don't want to endorse these negative uses of identity. but I do want to maybe take more seriously how these identities are absolutely critical for allowing us to organize. And again, r/place gives us an existence proof that we can organize at large scale, where everyone is given very limited resources for action, but they're given almost unlimited resources for identification and group cooperation. And that's really all you need to organize a political situation. I think, in fact, r/place not only gives us a model for organizing society, organizing at a political level, but they also give us a model for dealing with terrorists, for dealing with deliberately uncooperative actors. Uncooperative actors are a problem in the election system. Uncooperative actors are a problem in the sort of democratic institutions that we've come to build over the last few centuries. But they're not necessary, and we can imagine a political scenario where we're not vulnerable to a few bad actors, where we're not vulnerable to these systemic abuses from people with concentration of power, that it's possible to level out the power and give people very limited resources for action, but lots of resources for cooperation, and from that to build a social system that works for everyone. So we all have a stake in this fight. I don't mean to call you an asshole, I'm sorry. But that's the end of this video. Let me put myself back on screen and say thank you for listening, and hope this is okay. I was under 2 hours in this video. I'm a little bit happy with that, but yeah, thanks, and I will see you in the next lecture.